Thank you so much for joining us. We have an excellent panel here today, including two absolute leaders in the Australian blockchain world who'll be joining us on Zoom. Joni Pirovich, who's a lawyer who has done some really important policy work in the general area of blockchain, and particularly DAOs in Australia, as well as having her own private practice and helping people through all the tricky legalities that are arising. And we have Deeb, who is one of the co-founders of Mycelium, which is one of the very impressive and successful blockchain companies that's been originated out of Australia, but interestingly, with TracerDAO has really been a kind of DAO first organization. So it'd be fascinating to hear from him and his experiences. I should say that his experiences are very much in the decentralized finance arena, which is, interesting for all kinds of reasons that we'll get to. And my esteemed colleagues from RMIT over here, we have Kelsey Nabin, who is a researcher in the Blockchain Innovation Hub, also an ADM+S scholarship PhD student, and I should say an absolute thought leader in the world of DAOs. If you don't follow her Substack, you absolutely should. It's great. Chris Berg, who is the co-director of the Blockchain Innovation Hub, and Darcy Allen, who's a researcher in the Blockchain Innovation Hub, and myself. So I'm Ellie Rennie. I'm a professor and future fellow in the Blockchain Innovation Hub, as well as the Digital Ethnography Research Centre and ADM+S, and AI in ADM+S. So it's great to be here. I wanted to also say, this is just a little bit of a promo. This is almost a teaser for an event that we're going to be running in the week 12th of December, which will be an ADM+S week around blockchain governance more broadly. And we were kind of planning on doing a pre-conference to this at this time of year, which didn't quite work out because some of the international speakers weren't able to make it. So, I've done my typical thing and I've made my life a whole lot harder by turning a day into a week of events, but it's going to be huge and it's going to be wonderful. So I do hope if you're around, if you can join us then as well. That will be an event that will be involving a whole lot of people from MetaGov, which is a decentralized network of researchers doing internet governance stuff broadly, but certainly a critical mass of people looking at blockchain governance in particular. But today the topic is decentralized autonomous organizations. And I'm going to throw straight to Darcy Allen to tell us exactly what that is.
Fantastic. Thank you very much for having me, Ellie. So what I'm doing in this talk is I'm going to do a little bit of scene setting. I know there's a lot of people in the audience and online probably who haven't been in the world of DAOs or decentralized autonomous organizations. So this is setting the scene a little bit. What are we talking about here? And why should you care? And why should we care at the ADM+S? I want to start though with a story of what seems like a somewhat trivial example. In late 2021, myself and 17,000 of my closest friends on the internet decided that we wanted to buy a copy of the United States Constitution, which was going up to auction in the United States. So a core team decided we are going to fundraise some money to bid for this artifact, this physical artifact. As you can see there, we raised around $40 million in the space of 7 days, globally raised this money. What that meant is that individuals put in funds into this DAO, into Constitution DAO, and in return, they got tokens and they became members of that DAO. The purpose there was that we could decide as a group for anyone who had put money in where we would store this physical copy if we won, what insurance we would have, maybe we would decide to sell it. Now, this seems like a relatively trivial example of what a DAO is, a decentralized autonomous organization. But what's amazing is that This didn't happen by spinning up a firm or a company in 7 days. This happened online, digitally, with smart contracts at the core on a blockchain in a very short period of time. Now, DAOs, as we'll talk about all the way across this panel, can be used for many, many different purposes. In the same way that when we think about companies, companies don't have one purpose. They are a structure for achieving many different purposes. So what is a DAO beyond that trivial example of Constitution DAO? Well, a DAO, as many people have said, is really an online community where people share resources to achieve some shared goal. Now, that goal could be, let us buy a copy of the US Constitution. It could be, let's fundraise capital to help some particular social cause. It could be, as Jack will talk about, I'm sure, to manage a decentralized finance protocol. Maybe we would like to make some collective investments. There are a whole range of different goals, but the fundamental principle around this is that we have an online community that forms with smart contracts at the core of that online community. And there are various voting and decision processes that surround this so that we can achieve our shared objective over time. Now, there's a lot of principles and characteristics that are thrown around about what DAOs are. You'll hear a lot about permissionlessness with people. Anyone can come and enter this DAO. So in Constitution DAO, you just had to donate some money. They're open organizations. There's semi-autonomous elements to them. And we'll get to that a little bit more. But at the core of them, there are smart contracts that automatically execute some functions. And they're also autonomous in the sense that they are very hard to shut down or have outside influence on them. So those are a lot of the principles that you'll hear about when we're talking about DAOs. So 2022 is touted as the year of the DAO. That's the year that we are in, of course. And what that means is that we're seeing a wide range of experimentation of DAOs across a whole range of different areas. This is just a screenshot from deepdao.io, which shows you the size of some of these organizations. These aren't just somewhat trivial examples like Constitution DAO. We're talking about multi-billion-dollar DAOs that are running and coordinating around major projects and parts of Web3. You'll see there that some of the fundamental statistics, we have how many proposals have been put up to that DAO. So proposals around how do we spend that shared pot of money, or proposals about should we collaborate with another DAO? Maybe we should swap some tokens with them. And you'll see lots of active participants. These are really thriving online organizations that are mediated through code. Now, as an institutional economist, so I come at this from an economics perspective largely, these are a really interesting development. Because in society, as I look around, what I see are a whole range of different ways that we organize ourselves and collaborate to achieve shared objectives. Sometimes we use firms, right? We have shareholders and boards and managers and hierarchies. Sometimes we use markets, and we use market mechanisms of competition and reputation and so on. Sometimes we use governments to do things too. And DAOs sit within that same set of different organizations that we as groups can use to coordinate together. And what they do is that they enable us to solve two fundamental problems that all of these different types of organizations solve in different ways. They enable us to solve knowledge problems. How do we decide what to do and how to do it? You could do that through a firm, you could do it through a market, you could do it through a state, or you could do it through a DAO. And they also solve incentive problems. How do we stop bad actors, and how do we incentivize the types of behavior that we would like to incentivize? So when you think about DAOs, think about them as competing with these other types of organizations that are much more familiar to us. And at the moment, what we're doing is we're experimenting with them and trying to find out what they are good for. So what are they good for? What do DAOs do? That is you are not going to be able to see that from the audience, but that is a DAO landscape. So I will describe it with words. DAOs are used for many different things. As I mentioned, some of the largest DAOs are there to organize a protocol. So we have decentralized finance protocols, such as a decentralized exchange, and some parameters within that protocol might need to be changed. Maybe we need to update the software. Maybe we need to deploy the treasury to build out a new product. Now, instead of organizing that process in a firm, many protocols are deciding to do that through a DAO. So developing an online community, a process of voting and proposals and aligned incentives to achieve that objective and to evolve over time. And there are a whole range of other causes apart from just decentralized finance. There are a lot of DAOs around social good. Maybe we would like to arrange charities and charity donations in this way. Maybe we would like to create social clubs online. And this is a way to leverage some of those social incentives. Maybe we'd like to hand out grants in a particular way, guided by the community, and the community decides where those grants go. The point I'm trying to get across here is that DAOs are used for an enormous number of purposes, and we can get caught up talking about their characteristics, but in the same way that if we had just invented the firm or the nation state, and someone described it to you as, well, there's shareholders and a board and a principal agent problem, and we'll segregate it in this way, it doesn't get to the core of what a firm can do as an organization, of what we can do to achieve things using these different tools. But finally, why should you care? So what I've painted here is this emergent industry and series of organizations online, new ways that we are coordinating, where we have shared capital and shared resources. But why should you care about that? Well, of course, automated decision-making and society. There is automation at the core of these organizations, not on the periphery. So the very center of a DAO is centered around how that shared capital, that treasury, is held. And it's held as digital assets, often in a multi-signature contract on a blockchain, right? There is automation at the core, but we don't know how far out that automation should go. How much of those decisions in a DAO should be automated, and how many should be thrown out to more traditional processes? Or maybe we can integrate automation in different ways, where there are automated decisions being made outside these organizations, but coming in different ways to inform them. So automation is at the core, and we don't know what the implications of that are yet. The second part that I find really interesting, and I think why we should all care, is because this is a new model of early community ownership of digital organizations. So a lot of the issues that we have seen in Web 2, or a lot of the criticisms, include because users don't necessarily get rewarded for their activities in platforms. Often DAOs have that process of community ownership and community involvement and user ownership much, much earlier in their process. They're driven by community from the start, rather than waiting, for instance, until a company goes public, as we would see in Web 2. So community ownership goes right at the core. For instance, it's quite common in a DAO to do an airdrop or give some free governance tokens to early users of a protocol. So if you're an early user, you might be rewarded with some governance rights in this shared organization. That's a very common part of the DAO process. And it really flips a lot of the models that we see in Web 2 on its head. But again, I'm an institutional economist, and why do I care about this in a broader, long-run sense? What DAOs do is they power up the process of institutional innovation. The innovation that we saw in those other institutions that I showed before, firms and markets and states, happen quite slowly, right? They don't evolve that much. DAOs are evolving incredibly quickly because they are so open, because they are so competitive. We're seeing an enormous amount of innovation in the way that we make and enforce group choices for a whole range of processes. And of course, this won't work in many circumstances. In many circumstances, it will be much more effective and efficient to achieve your vision through a firm. But in many circumstances, particularly where you need knowledge and input from your community, particularly where you have a global vision, these institutions and the ways that they are structured may best achieve that particular objective. So I'm going to leave it there. I hope what I've done is given you a bit of an introduction into what DAOs are. And the key thing to understand here, without going into the intricate details of how they work, is these are online communities that spin up often very quickly. There is some pooled capital or resources that they control, and there is often collective decision-making around how we use those resources to achieve our objectives, whether it is running a DeFi protocol, whether it's running a charity, or whether it's trying to buy copies of the United States Constitution. Thank you.
Thanks, Darcy. Hard act to follow. Darcy makes it all sound kind of easy. I'm going to talk about the bits that are not very easy. What I want to talk about is actually the very question of how do you know people's contributions in a permissionless organization such as a DAO and effectively reward them for that work and labor. And there have been a number of different attempts to address this problem. The one that I have been quite deeply studying is a very early DAO tool, it's called, which is it's called SourceCred. So SourceCred was the community, but also the product. It was a community that was dog fooding its own product, a product that enables you to be able to see contributions via an algorithm and to pay people for those contributions. Anyone could come and go through that organization, and it would know you and be able to reward you, hopefully. That research is actually now morphing into work with another group called Govern, which is doing something similar, but where what they're creating may even enable us to be able to see contributions across different DAOs or protocols as well. That's, I think, one of their goals. But I should say the work that I've been doing here is with Michael Zargham of Block Science, who's also been working with Kelsie. And one of the things that we have built is called the Telescope bot, because these communities often use the Discord application to be able to convene and do the informal discussion that precedes decisions and the rest of it. We actually came up with a bot that enables us to, enables people within that community to alert the bot when there's a comment that is relevant to the research, and the bot then goes and asks the author if they're okay with us to include that in the data set. Anyway, you can read all about that in an issue of Qualitative Inquiry that recently came out, which was an ADM, it came out of a different ADMS event that Sarah Pink organized and edited that volume. So it's a kind of tool for digital ethnography, essentially. So that was part of the research method of what I'm talking about today. But I'm going to actually skip ahead quickly to the final slide, because this is really, I think, where my research is landing. I should say, this is a very popular crypto meme. I don't know if it's familiar to non-crypto people, but it's kind of an IQ scale. And at one end of the scale, it's the people who don't really understand the thing and are asking the kind of simple questions or seeing it the simple way. And then there's the monk at the other end, who I should say is Michael Zargham, our collaborator. I'm somewhere on that scale, depending where I am in the COVID loop at any one time. But basically, I think, the people start off asking this question of how do you pay people in a permissionless organization? Then you kind of end up in this harder question of, well, actually, how do you recognize different kinds of labor and the kind of care work or support and things that people are doing that aren't necessarily coding, that can be measured by a plugin on Gitcoin, for instance. And then ultimately, which, you know, I think is where this research is going, is how do you actually set policy and direction of an organization through being able to see people's contributions and effectively the taxonomy of actions, and to give them enough legibility and insight into what's going on in the organization to set priorities and policies, and to be able to change that algorithm itself as they go. So I'm just going to go back now. So what I wanted to quickly say is how they work. So this is a list specifically related to SourceCred. Importantly, like, this is a very complex piece of software that was built by someone who was, you know, at Google at the time, who decided that they would take the Google PageRank algorithm and amend it to so that we end up in a society where things which are actually valuable are the things that get rewarded, like teaching, you know, that kind of thing. That was the big long-term goal of this. So it's a complex piece of software, which I won't explain, but just to say that it's relational, it kind of uses social graph technology, and an algorithm which kind of runs over the graph to be able to generate scores, which are used for payouts. It is fed from plugins via GitHub for developers, but as this community went along, they built one for Discourse, which is the forum website that a lot of blockchain groups use for voting and deciding on things, as well as Discord. So the Discord stuff was like calculating emojis and things like that. That all went into this massive kind of graph network. And if other people thought something was valuable, or if that thing was referred to in a future piece of work, you know, when that happens, that the original contributor kind of their score goes up and they get paid. So it's kind of interesting to think of almost like academic citations. So the findings, though, of the ethnography, which ran for quite a while, was that I think most importantly, people got paid, and they got paid to work on a software product. People who would never have gotten paid to work in Silicon Valley, people from, you know, people of color, people of different genders, people with different skills and talents kind of came in and got paid to work on this bizarre technology. I was originally interested in it because I saw it. I wanted to understand what custodianship of an algorithm by the people it affects looks like. And I did have some very important lessons on that front. And I think one thing that everybody who went into SourceCred kind of discovered was they had to undo a lot of their own experiences and assumptions around workplaces and try to work differently and relate to each other differently. And this product, I should say, SourceCred wound down. And this is what I'll get to, like the dog fooding experiment had some findings which I suppose may have contributed to that. But the product is still being worked on by some of the people in that community, not necessarily with the funding it had, and also may get picked up by other funders, but it's also being used in some big blockchain protocols. So just to, I suppose, say what I found from this, legibility was always the intention here. So the idea was that people would be able to see people's contributions, they'd be able to set priorities and achieve organizational alignment through being able to see it. But actually, it in many respects, the community kind of changed their behavior rather than changing the algorithm. And that had to do, I think, with the fact that it was quite a technical thing. But also just permissionless organizations are difficult. There was a lot of turnover. The priority in a community changes as that turnover happens. You get bottlenecks via when conflict happens, all the kind of typical things that happen in any community setting. Became tricky in this kind of organization. Someone said in a forum I held that it kind of self-selected for chaos. So the often work that was not very valuable to the product, to the advancement of the product, was what picked up attention by the algorithms. So by, you know, particularly in, say, if you're working in a Discord channel, things that people understand might be things like building a Discord bot that helps the maintenance of the community, but it doesn't actually help source credit the product. So, or people would come in and say, this is what I do well, so I'm going to do this for this organization, but it might not actually have been what the organization needed. So there's a whole lot of issues around that emerged. And I should say this was deliberately a non-hierarchical organization, very anti-capitalist in terms of its ideology. But ultimately, a lot of the problems are really around onboarding and offboarding. They tried to document their processes, but that was hard. And yeah, I suppose the big lesson was that you need to institutionalize feedback. You need to actually have quite deep governance and oversight and coordination to make these kinds of tools work effectively, which I think SourceCred, you know, if what they have learned is instructive for everything else that's happening now, because that idea of maybe what do you need to put in place before you introduce these tools is one of the big important lessons. So yeah, as I said, that's kind of where we got to with it. It's not just about paying people. I will say on the rewarding different kinds of labor, there was this really fascinating point in the history of SourceCred where the developers, you know, they weren't getting, their contributions weren't weighted very heavily. And they kind of said, yeah, no, this is good because it'll make us work harder to, you know, and it'll reward people who are doing other kinds of work, like, you know, chairing meetings or whatever it might be. But they also felt that you know, you could use these algorithms to shine light on things that don't normally get attention, which I think ultimately didn't necessarily serve what they were trying to achieve, but it was a fascinating kind of decision of the organization. They always were trying to highlight these non-standard forms of work around software development that were occurring. Yeah, and ultimately it's about how do we enable organizations to evolve and to do so in a way that is achieving good things for the community and the world, and to, I suppose, do that where we don't necessarily need to have a constitution imposed from above, or we don't necessarily have to have very, very strict corporate governance rules. Maybe there are other ways of doing things. And that's ultimately what this case study, an ongoing area of research is about for me. There's a post, Observing the Cred Experiment, which is on the SourceCred Discourse Forum if you want to read more about those findings, currently in the process of writing them up. Thank you. Online speaker, correct? Yes, Joni. Take it away, Joni.
Shall I do a test check? Can you hear me? I can't hear you anymore, so I'm going to go with the nods. Yeah.
Someone do thumbs up? Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you. I could just listen all day. I love tuning in on the research that all of the team are doing at the RMIT Blockchain Innovation Hub. I guess I'm the lawyer in the room today, so one thing that I do want to address up front is that I think laws and our legal system people are feeling more and more disconnected from them, and that includes the tax system too. Every day or most days in the week, I hear people say, oh, I've went to my accountant, you know, they're either on the ATO side or they're on our side, which means they're either trying to save the person tax money or not. And there's a disconnect because people don't know that the tax is going into a government which is supposed to be paying for our public and our social goods, for the welfare of our country and our people. And because of that disconnect, it's one of the reasons that I love DAOs, that where we may be relearning the lessons of why the company was initially introduced into legislation and the lessons of corporate governance. But we don't really have mechanisms in the law and our legal system to do that storytelling or to create those experiences for innovators, students, people working in existing companies and institutions. They're, running the rat race, or they're on that hamster wheel, and DAOs are allowing us to do things differently, including how we experience the development of social norms or the relearning of social norms through automation. Exactly what Darcy took us through, that this automation is at the core, and the question for us is, to what extent can we automate? And a lot of this automation in these utility protocols, like the financial ones mostly, have been built as primitives or as parts that are done alongside other parts in a company. So a bank doesn't just provide the ability for you to deposit your money safely. It also has lending, it also has securitization, sometimes it has credit card and debit card products. But all of those different parts, what we're seeing in DAOs and these utility protocols is that they're doing one function and they're automating it very well. And the communities and the governance through the token holding is giving us a lot of insight into whether that is better or worse or just different. And people want different sometimes than how our existing experiences are as users and consumers of these products, as well as being on the other side as providing those products and services, and particularly financial services. So your place in an organization, whether you feel like it's meaningful and purposeful, or if you're really just working to live, not living to work. And so as a lawyer, myself, I'm going through a self-discovery process on the meaning that it's bringing out into the interpretation of laws and why we have laws, and how DAOs and their approach to these things are making them more relatable, but also repeating the mistakes of the past in a different way. And so I will just spend 5 minutes on some of the common mistakes that I see people make that they perhaps wouldn't if they did get some initial legal and tax advice up front. I'll do the disclaimer that I am a lawyer, but I'm not your lawyer. So anything I discuss today is general, and please go get your own independent professional advice. But one of the most common mistakes that people make is DAOs are unregulated. Crypto and tokens are unregulated. Therefore, without a business plan, without any business experience, I can spin up a DAO or I can contribute to one with no worries. And I'm here to tell you that's not correct. Even if you're in an unstructured or what we call an unwrapped DAO, the law has these deeming provisions where you can still be a partnership or an unincorporated association or a tax law company or a tax law partnership, upon which the existing laws do apply to you as if you were formally registered with one of the regulators or consumer bodies. So even though you might feel that you're unstructured or that there's no paperwork or no formal rules or constitution yet, where you are making representations to the public, it might initially be your family and friends, but it also might be those 17,000 worldwide friends that Darcy has. If you're involved in making those representations, and to the extent that they're promises that people rely on, that can leave you very exposed from a legal and tax perspective if you don't live up to those representations or promises, or you suddenly get $45 million worth of capital in and you've got no governance, no experience or ability to safely deal with and allocate that capital because you don't have a constitution that states your purpose or your remit for making decisions or bringing on another 500 people that can make decisions up to $10,000 worth. These are all the lessons that we have learned through corporate governance and that we often see built into the policies. And in big organizations like those banks, there are hundreds of policies which people don't read. So they often rely on their manager or in the induction being told about those things. And so I really liked what Ellie was saying, that one of the big issues we're seeing is onboarding and offboarding. And as there's turnover, the priorities change. Unless those policies are read, or you've got some continuity of people in the organizations to share those stories, this can be one of the big red flags from a legal and governance perspective as to when an organization is about to topple over, or if there is a likelihood of fraud, mismanagement of money, and all of which contribute to a lack of trust and potential, if you've invested in those tokens, to be able, as a precondition to be able to contribute, or because you are passively investing in that project through its tokens. These are the things that can be those red flags that you may be losing your money sooner rather than later, and increasingly your reputation if you've been involved with a number of projects that have repeatedly failed. So the scariest one for people to take away with is, if you are a core contributor to a DAO and voting on those proposals, if they are claiming or proudly saying that they're unstructured or unwrapped, this could mean joint and several liability for you, which means if a regulator comes knocking, from a financial services perspective, that capital has been raised and not spent appropriately, or if there's a tax bill due and there's not enough funds in the Treasury to pay that tax bill, joint and several liability means that even though there might be 17,000 people around the world that are the governance token holders, if you're the easily identifiable one and you've had some level of involvement in those governance decisions, the regulator need only go after you for the whole lot. So if you have your house in your own name, other assets like shares and other tokens, a bankruptcy trustee that is appointed to you can sell all of that. So that's not something that a person should expose themselves to. And this is another one of the reasons why the company came about and gave limited liability. So that within the framework, the legal framework of running a company, you could take risks, calculated risk based on proper information to the market and to stakeholders, and that if things did go awry, then the company could be wound up, but you as a person are treated legally separately. So the creditors of the company and other affected stakeholders should not be able to pierce that corporate veil to reach into your personal assets, unless, of course, you've been involved in fraudulent behaviour. So that's probably more grim than people realise, but it does scare me with the number of people involved in DAOs that say, all you need to do is contribute, keep voting on those decisions, get the token rewards, and you can get a very, very high status in the community, and that gets you more status in another DAO. And that's one of the most worrying things that I can hear if they haven't set up their legal structure properly and properly thinking about the consequences that may come from those sorts of decisions. And as we've seen with a number of smart contract exploits, there are hundreds of millions of dollars sometimes that have been lost or that are at risk because the technology is still nascent and experimental. So aside from all that, I still love DAOs, and there are ways that you can conduct yourself to protect and mitigate against some of those risks. So one of the things is, if you're a core contributor, set up your own limited liability company and be an independent contractor to that DAO. If you're not sure of the legal status of the DAO yet, do your own deed. Get a lawyer to help you write a one-way deed that says, my basis of participation is as an independent contractor. I don't treat this as being in partnership with any other person, and have some of those key clauses, boilerplate clauses, to protect yourself in the event that things do go wrong. And things do, because they're experimental. So the only other thing that I wanted to say is regulators are catching up quickly, as are policymakers. What we are looking at to determine residency and control as to who might be responsible and liable in a DAO when things do go wrong. One of the key metrics is these proposals and who's authoring them, who's submitting them, and who's voting on them. And this perception of decentralization, that you might have an equal spread of core contributors or governance token holders all around the world that are putting up these proposals and that are voting on these things to go through as software upgrades or different governance and community models. When you look deeper, if you see a common set of wallet addresses with a concentration of token holdings, this illusion of decentralization does start to, finally, we can see the roots of it. And that's where we're starting to get some truths that despite its claim as a DAO, it is not reached a state of sufficient decentralization yet, or sufficient global decentralization to warrant that it is outside the regulation and supervision of any one country or a couple of countries. And this is where you might see mainly US regulators and increasingly Australian. They will start deep diving into the voting composition, whether the same author is submitting the proposals, to identify if it's just an Australian doing it or a core team of Australians. So the legal uncertainty comes in when something is truly global. But if it's centralized to a particular jurisdiction, then that does create more of a claim for a regulator to say, you should have had an Australian financial services license, or you should have paid company tax because you're a tax law company or a tax law partnership. And hey, because you didn't get the advice on time and you're paying on late, these are the penalties and interest that we will also slap on the fine or the tax shortfall, which is why it's important to get some advice up front before you start contributing in the space. So I'll leave it at that.
Amazing. Thank you, Joni.
Kelsey, you're up next. Yeah.
Very sobering. Yeah, I just want to say how grateful I am for each of your interest in this area, both to think about the opportunities and some of the challenges and limitations, as well as to contribute to the shaping of what is a very new field, which is partly what makes it so exciting. And I guess we're very fortunate at ADM+S and connected to the Blockchain Innovation Hub in terms of, second best crypto economics research center in the world. Ellie is a leading ethnographer in the space and training other ethnographers, including myself as a supervisor. And yeah, a number of researchers in the room are also a core part of the team at the hub, which is really exciting. So first of all, I want to situate us back in the context of automated decision-making in society. And then I'll talk a little bit more about some of my PhD research and some of the journeys that that has taken me on and some of the potential insights there. So I'm speaking about governance of algorithms and governance by algorithms. So again, I'm interested in these questions of how do you have algorithmic systems and how do you structure the governance of those systems? So in terms of contextualizing a DAO and another kind of way to look at it or to approach it is as a socio-technical system. So that's why there's kind of something for everyone in an ADM+S context, is because we have these inherent human community social dynamics, as well as quite deep sort of technical dynamics with the engineering. And of course, we've heard a little bit about the kind of economics in terms of the incentive alignment that's going on here. And so some of the questions in kind of a methodology that I've developed through my research, which I'm calling an ethnography of a DAO in a paper that I'm working on for EPIC, is some simple questions around what is being organized. So what is the kind of animating purpose of this organization when I'm thinking about wanting to research it? What is being decentralized? So Joni spoke from a legal perspective around, who holds governance tokens. What is being automated? So are there smart contracts that are automatically executing transactions or processes based on a predefined set of rules? Who or what is being made autonomous? And that's a really interesting question in this acronym here around how people conceive that. And I wouldn't say that there's a very kind of comprehensive understanding even within DAO communities of what this means. And I've got here on the slide that there's this bias towards libertarian ideas of kind of freedom and self-determination and that independence from external political direction or coercion. And then that's often kind of synonymized with these ideas of automation. So we can achieve, political independence through technology and automation. And I think that's where, the expertise of, the research center is really important in contributing to these ideas. And one of the well-known sort of leaders, I guess, in the decentralized community space is Vitalik Buterin, the co-founder of the Ethereum blockchain. And there's this quote when he talks about DAOs, DACs, and more in a blog post in 2014, where he talks about algorithms at the center, or AI ultimately at the center, and humans at the edges. And these ideas get picked up and perpetuated in DAO experimentation in communities today, with some people even excited about the idea of humans out of the loop. And then that tension of other contributors in the space saying that you need humans in the loop to actually, contribute to providing context and to contribute to shaping algorithms. So if you're designing algorithmic processes, that itself is a governance decision. And so that's requiring human input. It's not an unbiased activity. And so how do you structure governance in a human machine ensemble? And I guess that sort of links me to my specific PhD research, which is in resilience in decentralized technologies. So as I mentioned, I'm interested in kind of contributing to the thinking about how these systems should be shaped, and then also in better understanding the social outcomes. So who's using them, why are they using them, where and what for, and then what happens when they do. And so DAOs have been a kind of key pillar of my case studies in my PhD research, alongside decentralized storage protocols and open hardware. So kind of how do you decentralize down to the microchip level in socio-technical systems. But some of the interesting things going on in DAOs come out of a large and quite well-known in blockchain communities DAO called Gitcoin DAO. So to answer some of my own research questions I positioned there, Gitcoin DAO is around funding public goods as their kind of animating purpose. So they have a treasury, which is largely based on donations, and their goal is to allocate that to open source research and software development. And so they've actually, just when I started studying them was when they were transitioning to a DAO and kind of taking this, what I termed kind of, exit to DAO, or a colleague called Dexit approach to very rapidly do a big retroactive airdrop. So they tried to calculate contribution based on past participation in the system. They gave people a whole lot of governance tokens and then kind of said hands off. And some of the original co-founders, posted graphs on Twitter of, my new bosses. And it was, just other people that had got sort of large shares of governance tokens, which is kind of a terrifying process when we come back to what Joni was just talking about around, who's identifiable in these things and can ultimately be held liable, perhaps. And so Gitcoin had a lot of things to figure out in their governance, a lot of different dynamics around stewardship and contribution and how they were going to structure their organization. But one specific area which I focused on quite deeply was their Sybil detection and defense. So how were they going to use a machine learning process to identify potential Sybil attacks? And this was a key issue because of the algorithms that they used in their crowdfunding. So the more people that were interested in funding your project, the more funds that you got according to the algorithm. So there was a strong incentive to create multiple fake identities to try and game that system and get more funding. And so what an organization called Block Science, and Ellie mentioned the work of Michael Zargham, who's the founder of that, did alongside the Gitcoin community and the Gitcoin co-founders was start to create this algorithmic policy-making process. So starting to structure in line with the purpose of the organization and whatever they had that was kind of semi-constitutional. And in Gitcoin's case, it was their original terms and conditions of the platform, and position the algorithm in the context of, you know, those kind of guiding principles and ultimate purpose. So the community could then collaborate around it. So they've formulated working groups across all different areas of the organization, and one specific one in fraud detection and defense. And this was initially all volunteer-based and quite competent or, you know, qualified people for this job that understood how to then sort the data that the machine learning process had identified as potential Sybil attackers, label that data, and then go about enforcing sanctions against that behavior. And they used Ostrom's kind of commons-based principles to do graduated sanctions. So, you know, is this someone, you know, very deliberately, repeatedly trying to game the system? Maybe they get banned from the platform. Are we not 100% sure, or it's just a whole new community that suddenly, you know, found out about a project and a lot of, you know, people in China wanted to donate to it? Actually, it's real people. Then we don't have to, you know, sanction them at all, or we can inquire and try and find out through some of the identity layers of the system. So very, very interesting, very, very sophisticated, and very, very kind of evolutionary or on the fly dynamics emerge. And that hierarchy, I guess, is still being shaped in terms of what is the role of people in these systems and what is the role of algorithms. The point about subsidiarity I covered. I just wanted to mention that has kind of folded into some ongoing research and collided with some ideas by Marta Poblet at the Blockchain Hub. And we're doing some more stuff around fractal governance and trying to work with Son Tran, another colleague as well, to actually map DAO structures and see if they sort of represent properties of fractal networks. So again, very, very interdisciplinary area, and definitely a field worth further inquiry. So thank you.
I forgot to say that Kelsie actually flew in from the Ethereum conference last night. So, you know, 3 hours ago. So amazing that she is even awake, let alone so articulate. Thank you, Kelsie. Next, I think it's you, Chris, next on the list. Yes.
Cool. All right.
Yes.
If not,
and then
Jack, anyway.
Jack is concluding. Yeah.
And then Jack. Fantastic. Okay. So g'day. So I've been asked to talk about the economics of DAOs. I'm actually a stand-in for my colleague Jason Potts. Jason is an economist in the purest sense. I'm an economic historian. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to slightly distort the topic and try to take it from an economic and a history perspective, because I think it's an interesting way to frame how we think about DAOs. And certainly when Darcy was introducing the scale of innovation in DAOs, it's very much on that world historical scale. It's being compared to markets, states, and companies. These are things that we've invented over thousands of years and have really shaped our economy and society. And so to give it a bit of a historical perspective, I think is a nice thing to do. The other thing to do is also, I'm going to start by comparing it to firms. Firms are not the only potential comparison that we can use for DAOs at all. I tend to think about DAOs as, well, here's how they're different from firms, but we could think of them, again, to Darcy's point, we could think of them as different from states because they're kind of democratic in lots of ways. We use voting instead of hierarchy to organize ourselves, but there are other institutions in society that DAOs look a lot like. They look kind of like cooperatives. They look like unincorporated communities, all these sorts of comparison institutions. And when we start thinking about DAOs, our natural instinct is to look at DAOs as they relate to other types of institutions in society. And I think I think I can make a point using the historical evolution of these institutions to sort of to explore the future of DAOs. All right. So as I said, I'm going to start though with firms. So the question is, a fundamental economic question that economists have been trying to answer for at least a century is, why do firms exist? For the most part, economists like markets. They like the idea that if you make exchanges in a market environment, it's more efficient. We can pursue our preferences. We can gain from specialization and trade. But then there are these huge firms. We don't just see markets out in society. We see these big firms. So a question for economists for a long time has been, well, why do we see so many firms? Why is so much of our economic activity structured in the firm? And there's a bunch of answers. I've got a few answers up on the screen there. One of them is team production. We have firms because there are just some things that are better to do as groups. If we're all rowing in the same direction, we'll be more efficient than if we were all rowing in individual canoes. We gain from coordination. Very classic reason that firms exist. Oliver Williamson in 1985 had a more precise idea about why firms exist. And firms, in his view, they exist to reduce the cost of opportunism. So that's like people stealing from each other and so forth. They reduce the knowledge and information and uncertainty costs. That was what Darcy was talking about earlier. They reduce contractual lock-in. Sometimes it's much better if you own the entire production and supply chain than if you're contracting between, because you might find yourself being trapped by some of those contractual terms. Really interesting. I'm not going to get into it here. Even more precise again, Oliver Hart in the late 1980s, for which in fact Williamson and Oliver Hart got Nobel Prizes for this work, to allocate residual control rights. Again, I'm not going to get into detail about that, but that's the economic theory about why firms exist. And we've got very rich literature that covers that, that is quite difficult to put DAOs into. Because on a lot of these structural claims, a lot of this theory, it's quite hard to see why DAOs would be more efficient than a hierarchical firm, or even a state or a market or so forth. So I want to go back to why firms actually exist, not in theory, but in history. Where did the firm itself come from? The history of the firm, unfortunately, is told very much, tends to be told from a legal construct. And Joni has very coherently and I hope shockingly described well, there are really good reasons for that. But the history of the firm tends to be told from, well, when we invented the concept of corporate personas, when we invented the concept of, so corporate persona in the medieval era or late Roman era, when we invented the concept of limited liability, when we invented the concept of tradable shares, all of which gives us the firm that we know today. But firm-like organizations existed long before those quite legal structures existed themselves. All the way back into ancient Mesopotamia, we can see the existence of coordination mechanisms whereby groups of people came together to pursue a joint task together, even with some very modern ideas that we see in the firm and in DAOs. So one of the wonderful things about ancient Mesopotamia is that we've got these amazing documentary sources. And unlike some early writing around the world, a lot of that documentary sources is commercial in nature. So we learn a lot about how the ancient Mesopotamian merchants structured themselves. And in ancient Mesopotamia, we can see the way that caravans would seek venture financing. Investors would pool together funds in order to fund joint merchant expeditions between the various city-states of the ancient Mesopotamian landscape. Ancient Greece, we have effectively firms. We have banks, and we have large-scale firms in the size of large ancient Greek farms. And the ancient Romans had a really dense network of company structures that allowed them to do joint work together and to, in many times, allowed those firms to exist long after the death of any given member of that firm. So ancient Roman firms, the Societas Publicanorum, would provide goods, so they might get licenses and contracts to manage manage building projects. They would exercise licenses for mining, and more controversially and maybe terrifyingly, they would also do the tax farming. So the Roman state would license them to collect the taxes and so forth. Now, what's interesting about this comparison is that I think what we see with a historical perspective of the firm is the evolutionary nature of it. And when I look at DAOs, it looks a lot like that restructuring of economic activity in a discovery sense. So we're figuring out how to use a new type of economic coordination mechanism to pursue things that we don't really know how to do yet. We don't have a very good idea about how to run a decentralized finance application using a coordination mechanism that was designed for centralized finance, that is the corporation. So I think if we look back in history, we can see that discovery mechanism. So the modern firm itself, I would argue, is actually a really fixed institutional form. It's fixed by law, which is what Joni was talking about, but it's also fixed by practice. What we see in DAOs is evolution and discovery. We are figuring out how to run a DAO. We are figuring out what DAOs are good for. I've got a point here that DAOs themselves, I think one of the challenges that we have in the crypto space is we know that DAOs are a really interesting institutional form, but we have to find them product market fit. We have to figure out where they're effective, what they are effective at, and then how we can get some degree of effectiveness or efficiency. They look a lot like the nature of the firm pre-incorporation. And of course, to the point that Joni was making, at the same time as they're evolving, as we're trying to figure out what DAOs are good at, we see legal authorities trying to figure out how DAOs can be regulated. So that is evolving at the same time. So I'd like to leave with a couple of questions about DAOs. I've hinted at one already. How can we make DAOs effective? Now, I was going to write efficient, but I'm not convinced that efficient is the right word here. How can we make them effective at whatever they go that they're intended to do? That's really what Ellie's research is about. How can we make sure that people are rewarded for contributions in a way that supports the organization, in a way that supports the DAO, that makes it more effective? That's also a lot of what Kelsey's research is as well. I would add to this also, how can we drive entrepreneurial innovation within the DAO structure itself? How can you get a decentralized community to make the entrepreneurial decisions that we know are needed to build a successful organization, to bring product to market? A number of speakers have already touched on the really important question of how can we balance the human decision-making with automated decision-making. I would add to that though, how can we do so in an inherently global first institutional environment? I think one of the things that is unique about DAOs is that they are global first. They don't have to make themselves into multinational organizations. They are on day one multinational organizations. Anybody can participate from around the world. That has really interesting practical consequences, but it's got really interesting consequences from an effectiveness and efficiency perspective as well. It's got interesting law, tax, but because we've invented, I think we've invented a form of organization that is designed very well for a globalized type of economic activity that we see in the crypto space, in the Web3 space, in the blockchain space. So those are some of the questions that I have. Ultimately, I think what's fascinating about DAOs is that sense that we are building suddenly a new form of economic organization where we have just a giant menu of options to choose from, to design it in a way that is just more interesting than the institutions that we've had before. So I'll leave it there and keen to hear what everybody else has to say.
Thank you. Okay, so last but absolutely not least, we're going to throw to Jack on the Zoom to hear about an actual real life experience at trying to do this. Take it away, Jack. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Ellie. I'll look for a thumbs up from someone on the panel just to make sure that, yeah, okay, perfect. Great. Hello, everyone. As Ellie mentioned, Mycelium has been building on blockchain since 2018, and we've been actively involved in a number of DAOs, including the LAO, which is an investment DAO, and more recently, TracerDAO, which is the DAO that governs the Tracer protocol. So I'll certainly be reflecting on that experience while talking through the topic that I've been asked to speak on today, which is identity issues and reputation in DAOs. To start with more of a Web 2 than Web 3 themed thought, I was listening to some of Mark Andreessen's comments, who was the founder of Netscape, one of the earliest internet browser. And the question that was asked to Mark was, what is one thing that you wished you established earlier in the context of the internet through Webscape? And the interesting component of Mark's answer was acknowledging that at the time they weren't thinking about it, but being able to establish identity or tie identity to internet participants was one thing that Mark regarded as a mistake in the early development of the internet. And I think it's really interesting in the context of where we are with public blockchains and Web3 development, that this conversation is at the fore of some of these early developments, being what is identity in relation to these systems, and more importantly, how should identity relate to these systems? To set the scene about identity in Web3, I'd just like to start with a bit of an explanation of what a DAOs and more importantly, what a public blockchain. So I see public blockchains as globally accessible networks, as Chris mentioned. Any user with an internet connection can create one or more accounts or even contracts in these systems that are identifiable only by a unique string of numbers and letters, which is called an address. And these addresses, which are either accounts or contracts, can then interact with each other. And this could be account to account or contract to contract, or an infinite string of contract and account interactions. And the important piece is that the data generated from these transactions or from these interactions is recorded and made available again to everyone with an internet connection. A DAO is usually one or more of these smart contracts where governance is encoded and carried out by either the code itself or a group of members who each have their own addresses and contribute to the system, or a combination of both, to Kelsey's point. And usually the DAO is interacting in relation to digital assets or another DAO protocol. And that's me trying to define DAOs, and that's an incredibly complicated way to define DAOs. So I like Darcy's comment that a DAO is at a high level an online community with shared resources. And I really, really like Aaron Wright's explanation of a DAO, which has been prominent in the industry for some years, which a DAO can be thought of as a subreddit with a bank account. So I'm now going to talk through 3 identity issues which exist in the context of DAOs. And the first is privacy. In theory, a viewer of public blockchain has complete information about the accounts and transactions which exist on that network. The accounts are described as pseudo-anonymous, which is a term that in the space means that someone with an internet connection can observe an account's activity, but they do not necessarily know who the owner of that account is. One way to get around this problem is for the owner of the account to publicize that they are in fact the owner. We've seen a few coordinated examples of this, like proof of humanity projects, and we've also seen Twitter itself allow public display picture functionality, which effectively achieves the same end of tying your identity, if it does exist on your Twitter account, to your public blockchain account. But if an owner decides to do this, the complete on-chain transaction history and all of their assets held will be observable to the beneficiaries of the publication. And when I'm saying the word publication, it sounds like I'm talking about things like the Twitter example, where I could post my address on social media. But there are actually far more nuanced examples of this publication, where a disclosure could be something as simple as an interaction between a buyer and seller, or sender or receiver of any crypto asset. As public blockchains become used for more and more kinds of transactions, more of this transaction data will be tied to the public blockchain accounts. And when you start to think about this, the privacy concerns are clear. In society today, this kind of personal information is protected from public disclosure, for example, under the Privacy Act. And more than that, it's not the want or even expectation of society that I know all of the transactions that you've made and all of the assets that you own, and you equally have the same knowledge or information about me. So I think to conclude the privacy point, it's likely that in the future we'll see, firstly, an unwillingness to publicly display your public blockchain accounts. Secondly, each user of public blockchains continuing to have multiple different accounts that they use to interact with these systems. And thirdly, different methods of abstracting your on-chain activity from a public blockchain account, which is going to be publicized for some purpose. And that last point leads me to the second issue, which is KYC, or knowing your client or customer. So organizations, particularly companies, are required to identify those involved in their organizations, things like identifying your employees or your directors or your contractors, your customers. And this creates, when you take this obligation into Web3, it means that DAOs are required to know who they're dealing with for a whole number of different purposes. I think one of the purposes, which is really commonly discussed in the space, is anti-money laundering and counter-terrorism financing legislation, commonly referred to as AML/CTF laws, which exist in Australia, but also equivalently in other jurisdictions, which generally require organizations providing a broad range of services to report and investigate some transactions with respect to the parties that are involved in the transactions. So in DAOs and other peer-to-peer transaction systems that are emerging alongside these DAOs, these AML/CTF problems become very challenging to deal with, because it's usually smart contracts, which are things like DAOs, or protocols exist near DAOs, which are facilitating the transactions between multiple peers interacting with these systems. And more importantly than that, the information that's tied into the transaction, including something like the link between an account and the transaction itself, would often need to be provided on chain or otherwise be publicly visible in order to participate in an AML/CTF friendly way to the transaction. So we run really heavily into this disclosure problem that we started to unpack a little bit earlier. So in March this year, I worked with Joni and two other co-authors on a paper called ZK, KYC and DeFi, which really explored these issues in detail. If you want to spend an hour reading through 30 pages on the issue, then feel free to go do so. But it essentially proposes a way that users' information and documentation can be issued by a third-party KYC issuer, stored in an encrypted data object held in your public blockchain account, and that certain characteristics can be shared as necessary with verifiers or regulators for the purpose of according with the existing KYC obligations. This is a really hot topic in the industry at the moment, zero knowledge identity frameworks in general, like ZK, KYC and what we were writing about early in the year. We saw Vitalik, who, as Kelsey mentioned, very prominent figure in the industry, published a paper called Soulbound earlier in January this year. We saw the launch of Verite, which is a consortium started by Coinbase and Center in February, which is focusing on this issue. And most recently, Polygon, one of the larger Ethereum L2 solutions, launching a zero knowledge based identity system. So certainly worth keeping an eye on the developments here. The last issue that I wanted to discuss, but I think it's actually more of an opportunity than an issue, is reputation in public blockchains. If transaction data is tied to on-chain identity, then more and more we'll see forms of positive and negative discrimination with respect to that transaction history or information. Examples of positive discrimination would be things like encoded sophisticated investor thresholds or passing a KYC check like I was discussing before. Examples of negative discrimination would be things like exclusion from transactions based on OFAC sanctions or breach of a shared code of conduct in the context of a DAO. The vision here is that in the long term, through tying on-chain information or your transaction history and off-chain information, things like your jurisdiction or other personal information, to your public blockchain addresses, we'll see automated access or permission or denial to DAOs, but more importantly, to automated access frameworks to transactions themselves. There are many reasons why reputation will be useful and relevant in the context of DAOs. And I think, as Ellie mentioned, probably the most relevant example today is through tools like SourceCred, which incentivize governance via monitoring activity and discussions in forums like Discord, and also monitoring activity in proposals and voting for the DAOs themselves. But I think as our vision comes to fruition, the implications will be far broader. From an access perspective, we'll see the inability to participate in a certain transaction or to join a DAO, unless, for example, you're based in a certain jurisdiction, have a certain credit score, hold a certain amount of assets, or have exhibited some kind of bad behavior in the past. But interestingly, from an incentivization perspective, I can envision that we'll see complex customer incentivization frameworks, which build upon the principles of loyalty programs that we have today, but will actually be targeted, automated, and able to be used across multiple platforms or DAOs. So that's a lot of information in a short period of time. I hope it was useful, and look forward to a bit of question and answer.
Wow. Thank you. That was terrific, Jack. It'd be great to bring both Jack and Joni up on the screen if we can. I actually want to go straight to audience questions. I have a few up my sleeve, of course, but we've only got half an hour left. Yes, please take it away. There's a microphone coming actually, so that the people online can hear.
Hi, everyone. My name is Deeb. I'm with the Digital Asia Hub. Thank you so much for the excellent round of sort of presentations and talks, all super illuminating about an area I think that we all have lots to learn about. I sort of have a question, and this is going to, I think, Katie's point about the socio-technical system and DAOs. And so maybe bringing it in the context of the human into the question of crypto and DAOs. So for instance, I think of Tim Wu, and he's a legal scholar, and he talks about the information cycle and how in the history of time, things have tended towards centralization. And I think he wrote his book at the early days before things became as Web 2.0 became as centralized as it eventually has become now. And so much of DAOs and crypto is sort of seen as a solution to these problems of centralization and other sort of harms that have come out from this Web 2.0 world. I'm also a China scholar, and often when in the sort of discussions around the internet in the early days, people talked about how the internet is going to decentralize and sort of democratize the world. Whereas when we looked at like some of the policies coming out in China, it was very clear that the government did not see it that way, and saw that, even within this internet structure, centralization and control was very much possible, which we've now eventually seen come to born. So I guess my question is, what needs to change within like the people and so our thinking versus like the technology, which perhaps has always existed, but something about people and human condition has always pulled things back towards centralization. And so, and I also think, we talk about Vitalik, and I think he recently had a post where he was sort of criticizing some of the NFT community and like maybe like the Bored Apes and how things were maybe, he was like, why is there more funding towards public goods rather than like, towards entertainment, and basically like sort of criticizing some of the more, greed and sort of that aspect of crypto. And so, yeah, so just bringing it back, do you see risk where people maybe will pull back all these technologies into this world of centralization and manipulation? And so how do you see this? And I know we have anthropologists and we have historians and we have, legal scholars. So yeah, I open this to anyone on the panel here.
Can I take a first swing at this? Is that all right? Because I think you've just kind of rolled up like every critique of crypto into one question. So my background is actually in studying community radio. And one of the big frustrations I have about these overarching critiques of crypto is that it actually denies the power and reality of groups and organizations in the same way that those narratives about, community media will never actually change what Rupert Murdoch does, therefore it's irrelevant, denies the reality of people living in remote Australia for whom Indigenous radio is mainstream media, right? So I actually think that those critiques around centralization are similarly unhelpful, because really what we're looking at a lot of the time here is, yes, things might be centralizing, but they can be centralizing because of, what we need is expertise, or what we need is kind of people who understand how to maintain infrastructure under certain conditions, or whatever it might be. So I think we need a much more nuanced discussion than that. And I would also add, in response to Vitalik, who is the first person to say that he does not understand NFTs or how they became so big, is that the creative economy, as many people who are involved in CCI before know, like the creative economy is actually highly broken and problematic for artists and creatives themselves. And so Indigo and I and others here, including Tim, who's in the front row, who helped us coordinate this panel, I should say, are doing a report for Australia Council exactly on this, which will be out very soon, including how NFTs and DAOs are empowering artists in different ways. And of course, they're also changing the dynamics of investments and speeding up speculation and giving new tools to markets. But let's not deny the reality of people who are in it for other reasons as well. Anyone else want to take that back? Yeah. Have either of you got a response there on the Zooms?
I'll make a point, because I think the challenge that I see with DAOs right now is precisely the opposite problem. That we have an amazing, we have a lot of people who want to contribute in that decentralized environment. We have some just remarkable sense of community. But I want DAOs not just to be fun to be in. I want DAOs to be genuinely competitive against the other institutions in society, so that they can make contributions. And they're not going to, I'm not saying that they're going to, compete directly with firms on exactly what firms do, but or states or something like that. But I want to make sure that they're really adding significant value to society on whatever margin, however we would describe value. And in that sense, I don't think sometimes there's not enough centralization, or there's not enough capacity to make the decisions that would need to be done to make those effective. Now, I don't want to take that too far, but in a funny way, the challenge with DAOs is not that they're excessively centralizing. It's that we need to figure out how to make this quite decentralized community effective and competitive with otherwise centralized organizations.
And we're seeing that in the evolution of DAOs. So there is this idealized version of a DAO where you've got all of your token holders and they're voting on everything, and it's a combination of gridlock and chaos, and no one knows what they're voting on all at the same time. And the evolution of DAOs has actually been, well, we need some centralization within them. So we might elect some working groups or pods or committees, and you can be in charge of the grants program, and you can be in charge of this other thing. And that's really healthy, because the community is deciding to do that. They're more like pockets of centralization, but still with some sort of overarching decentralized structure. But at the same time, this is different in my mind, because exit is much cheaper and easier in crypto and DAOs. So it's much easier to exit one of these systems if, for instance, there is centralization that you don't want. There's often a liquid market for the tokens. You can exit and go to another DAO. I think it's important to note around those competitive dynamics that if communities decide to have some centralization, then they should be free to do that, as long as, and you have rage quit mechanisms where you can leave a DAO and take your portion of the treasury and so on. So it's complicated, and we're seeing really what this is turning out to be is polycentricity within a decentralized framework. So there's a decentralized community, and then you have many centers of decision-making within it.
Great question though. Yeah, Justine.
Joni.
Oh, sorry, Joni's the response, and then.
Oh, sorry.
Very, very, very quickly, just to add that this is one of the policy questions that we need to solve too. So to the extent that existing laws and regulations may not or will not apply, we need to come up with some tests to justify why they shouldn't. And the global nature of these things makes it out of reach and difficult for any one government or regulator to supervise. But another test that is bubbling up is whether there's a net public benefit produced by the DAO, and what utility or community strength or resilience that it's building. And so if you can see that being possible and needing to occur in a global socio-technological environment, then that may be one of the justifications that we relax or we ignore existing laws. Maybe you have non-binding reference back to the lessons learned from them, but this may be the foundation upon which such structures can have the flexibility and freedom to re-explore the new economic model of doing business and doing communities differently on a global level.
Look, thank you very much. That's been really interesting. And as I said before the session today, I actually know nothing about DAOs. So Excuse me if this question seems really naive, but and I've learned a lot, but what I'm really interested in is, we've been doing distributed community online for a really long time now. Multi-user object-oriented sites, Lambda Moose, so on. These were sort of early experiments in distributed communities. Social media, platformized community organizing and community coordination, and community communication. And I've heard you mention Discord a few times. You've mentioned subreddit. These are platforms that support communication, which is essential for community organization. And I get that DAOs are another economic model for rewarding participation and contributions. What I don't get is what is going on with the communication side of community organization. It feels like it's untethered from the DAO, or is it happening in the same space? It seems like maybe these sorts of the communication which is required for a DAO is taking place outside of the platforms that are actually, or the software, the flows of information that are organizing the economic model. So can you talk a little bit to me or to us about whether that is actually a correct interpretation of what's going on, or does communication happen in the same space as the economic activity?
It's a great question, and it's a great question for a bunch of different reasons, because you're 100% right that what is the DAO? Where can I find it on the internet? And you can find it in a bunch of places of people who will self-describe as being part of the DAO. They will be on the project Discord, the DAO's Discord, or Discourse, or Commonwealth. They might be in the subreddit, or they might be just a reflection of whatever the token balance is on the blockchain itself. They might be using the products, or all these sorts of things. There's no central coordinating mechanism. And those two communities can be sometimes multiple communities that look like the DAO can be quite starkly divided. So Joni mentioned earlier the fact that in fact, while there are these fun online communities, there may actually be some really large token holders that have effective control over the DAO, even though they don't self-identify as having control of the DAO. And I see what you're describing there is precisely that division. We've got lots of people who describe themselves as small community members who are acting on the Discord and maybe doing some contributions, maybe building some things, doing some memes. But in fact, the economic power in the DAO is held by a group of people who may never contribute on those communication, that community base. So I think it's a really nice way, as you phrased it, it's a really nice way of describing one of the big challenges or governance challenges that we have. But Kelsey, you might,
Yeah, you very accurately identified a tension for people participating in these communities themselves, because they're coordinating on Web 2 platforms to do their whole decentralized ideological thing. But I just wanted to point out where I kind of started my research. My other supervisor is a historian, was with some of the history of what do I mean by decentralized technologies and where do they come from? And the communication there, or why is this different, is public key cryptography. So that ability to do things without being identified. And actually the cypherpunks was this, no big deal kind of, online/offline subculture in the 1990s and early 2000s that contributed a lot of the political ideology that aligned with the development of public decentralized blockchains. They were really, really keen on making sure they did use encrypted channels. They were also innovating to create remailers and in using encrypted email itself. So that's partly something which, to the previous question, will be carried through the ideology, but there's, it's such a heterogeneous community then and now that some people don't care about the privacy aspects and they just want to, have their NFTs or, do art, or they care about, regenerative finance or whatever. Sometimes that is lost in the sense of what made it unique in the first place was this absolute fetishism with the possibilities that encryption could create.
I think Jack's got a response to this as well.
Yeah, for sure. I think it's a fantastic question. As you were running through the question, I was thinking about what we've seen outside the Web3 space with remote work and an increasing number of global companies. Like really, they have nothing to do with DAOs, and yet we're seeing innovation in communication, people management, governance, and remote work software. And those software advancements and those methods of communication and coordination exist often separate from the corporate governance processes which exist for traditional companies. So I think that in a weird way, traditional companies are suffering with some of the same challenges where the corporate governance framework exists in a board meeting structure which is documented separately from where the work is being taken place. And that's just a broader comment about an evolving corporate governance landscape. I think for DAOs now, there are so many different DAOs used for so many different purposes without a standardized framework. So I think your observation is correct in terms of messiness and a lack of industry standard. I think certainly there's a separation that exists between where the funds exist and where formal proposals exist, which often happens in an on-chain environment, and then those broader elements of coordination, communication, which exist on platforms like Discord or Discourse or a whole range of other platforms. But I think we have to expect that these platforms and these methods of coordination and communication will increase and will become more aligned with corporate governance.
The only thing I'd add is that those people that we know well who study community moderation in online communities, we've got a lot more work for them.
Sounds like it.
Because I remember talking to a TracerDAO community moderator in Denver at an Ethereum conference there, and it was such a fascinating conversation about the kind of work that this guy was doing with people all over the world. Just really intense, fascinating stuff. Yeah.
Thank you.
Who's first?
It's the lady in the green.
Okay, down here
It's like
first. Yeah,
front to the back.
It's a race.
we'll get to. We've got over 10 minutes.
Hey, I just wanted to hear what you guys thought about the digital divide and questions around the digital divide in this space. And I guess another element of this question is the notion of community is relatively a contested term. So when we talk about community, how does this also play into digital literacy, digital divide, and questions around this space so if blockchain and this space and DAOs become a big thing, how do we assure that everyone is included? It's just not the privileged few.
I think it's an important question, and it's definitely kind of a non-trivial thing to get involved with blockchain at the moment. Having kind of studied internet adoption prior to coming into this, it was fascinating, for instance, doing work in remote communities in Australia and seeing mobile arrive. So there was internet available before then, but it was actually mobile and the ability to prepay. Actually, that was the thing that changed the game. Or Facebook, because people didn't keep phone numbers, but they kept their identity on Facebook. So my answer to that is we don't know what's going to drive adoption or what's going to create exclusion in these communities yet. So we see a lot. I mean, there's some problematic stuff going on, like a lot of people. I've heard stories of people getting into proof of humanity, which is one of the identity solutions, which is actually a bit problematic from a privacy perspective in South America, because there was a charismatic South American who was promising a UBI for anyone who kind of signed up for it, and paying enormous kind of gas fees on Ethereum at that point in time because of some expectations. So there are, I think it's also kind of what's interesting here in relation to inclusion and exclusion is, firstly, those kind of dynamics of hope and promises that come with crypto speculation in general. And but you also have kind of whole countries getting involved because of the destabilization of their fiat currency in the kind of global world order. So it's happening on a very, very macro scale, not just a micro scale. And yeah, I mean, I feel as though as well, this is not necessarily for everyone. I think we make this assumption with crypto that we are going to end up with a whole world onboarding onto it in the way that we have with the internet, but it might be more like polarization, where there are some people who never ever want to go near it, and others whose entire income and social world exists there. And you know, polarization is a reality in our informational world, and maybe it will be in our financial and organizational worlds as well.
I think right now it's probably not great. The onboarding process is really hard. You're trying to download a wallet, you need to buy some crypto and work all of this out for yourself. And I think that's a short-term problem though. The amount of effort that's going into DAO tooling to make that process easier is a really good thing, but it cuts both ways. It's not great right now, but once we have those tools, this can be an amazing thing to reduce that digital divide, in the sense that it doesn't matter what jurisdiction you're in anymore. It doesn't matter if you're 15. It doesn't matter what your previous history is. You can perhaps go and work for a DAO and earn some income. And that's the medium to long-term vision. And some of our colleagues at the Hub and ADM+S in the audience, Trent McDonald and Natalia, are doing some work here on what that changes in terms of labour dynamics and how that can in fact be a positive thing. So I just add that point. It kind of cuts both ways.
Any contribution from Joni? Go for it.
Just to say, this is why I'm increasingly interested in soul-bound tokens. They represent the ability to have intersectionality in decision-making. So if a soul-bound token were issued to me, and there's no specification yet, but I see it as a type of non-fungible token where the data is updated, I can say that I'm a woman, I'm a mother, I'm 10 plus years experience in tax and law. I might also say that I come from a remote and regional background. And so more of my attributes that I can put in, my reputational token, that might make me attractive or not attractive for particular DAOs, to have me as the delegate representing each of those sections in society, even though a number of my family and friends still in remote far north Queensland on the mango farms have absolutely no interest in looking at a screen for how long I do in a day. So I think there's quite a lot of promise there, and I'm doing some more experimentation in that field, and I encourage more people to do so if they're interested.
Any other response? Oh, okay. Maybe we'll go to here and then here. I don't know who was next. I'm sorry.
I think that gentleman.
Oh, okay. Right. Yeah. Sorry.
We need an auction platform.
We do.
Bid for questions. That's such a good idea.
Hi, my name is Rakesh. I'm a PhD student from Western Sydney University. Great panel. Very interested in DAOs, Web3, etc. My research kind of deals with that in terms of platform entrepreneurial work. So Web3 is a part of that, I think. But Web3 has been on crypto, has had a tumultuous 1 year, I think. A lot of hype and collapse, etc. So where do you think it evolving in the medium to long term? A question for each of you.
What did I say? Kelsey,
Please, no, speculate.
Speculate, yeah. Look, up only from here, obviously. Look, it's a super good question. Obviously, this is not the first cycle that crypto has seen. We've seen in this cycle, I think if you look at the Bitcoin price or the Ethereum price or whatever, those price movements obscure a lot of the action that's occurred and the changes between different peaks and troughs in really significant ways. And we've seen in this recent cycle, so from about 2020 to May, or maybe January, we've seen some really substantial use cases, of which DAOs are one of them, become operationalized, find a degree of product market fit. We've also seen non-fungible tokens. which are all the Bored Apes and those sorts of things. We've seen decentralized finance, which some of us on the panel work in as well. So we've seen really clear use cases. We've seen institutional investment into that as well. For what it's worth, I think if the Fed Reserve decides to crash the economy is going to crash. What is interesting this time in this particular cycle is that the crypto markets are very highly correlated with the rest of the tech sector, which tells us that it's gaining a degree of mainstream interest for traditional investors. Where is it going to go next? I think we're going to see more and more investment in it from large institutional players, and we're going to see more of the traditional finance sector move onto crypto payment rails, whether that's through the tokenization of traditional assets like fixed income products and bonds and those sorts of things and equities, as well as potentially central bank digital currencies. I think what the next cycle, as I see it, is going to be the merging of traditional finance and DeFi and crypto. So in a way that traditional finance can use the incredible rails that have been built over the last couple of years.
Yeah, although look what they did to it this time. Jack or Joni, any response? Yeah, I mean, the reason where we are is because more centralized finance companies were behaving poorly, and it's the DeFi ones that did okay. Jack, do you have a response?
I'm spelling out a dystopia, by the way, obviously.
Yeah, definitely. I think my perspective is firstly remembering where we've come from in discussing DAOs. I think the topic of the DAO was originally discussed in the Ethereum white paper. So conceptually, DAOs became technically possible in the way that we're talking about them today in 2015. 6 to 7 years later, we're now in a situation where I think based on conservative estimates, there's been about 1,200 public blockchains created in 12,000 different cryptocurrencies. And of course, the creation of those public blockchains, the DAOs, the cryptocurrencies, is all open, permissionless to anyone with an internet connection. I think some of the chaos and volatility that we've seen is expected. But I think some interesting observations is that education is really quite low. I think it's important that we have conversations like this, because in terms of where we're going, I think as education increases, the future will become more certain. At the moment, I was looking at some statistics the other day, which showed that about 0.01% of the population today has interacted with DeFi, which seems to suggest that around a similar percent of the population would have interacted with DAOs today. And despite that, it's something that is, discussed at a policy level in most leading jurisdictions and, on the panel today. So I certainly agree with Chris's point that as we see more education, as we see more access, as we see more distribution toward this technology, the picture will become clearer to more people with respect to where we're going.
Quickly before we move on. So it's crypto winter at the moment. Prices are down and everyone's a little bit sad. But there's been absolutely no shortage of industry partners walking in our door thinking, we're going to build, this is the time to build. And I know this is a room largely of researchers and scholars, and all of the questions that we've talked about on this panel are research questions, but they are directly applicable to what will be built out over the next few years. And what we're seeing is this, those research questions are more important than ever. They are shaping how these platforms are formed. They're shaping how those tools are built, how much automation is in there, overcoming that digital divide and so on. So we're not just observing this phenomenon, we're part of it. And I think it's just important to remember that. Where do I think it's going? I'm just really excited about how composable all of the elements are that we're building at the moment. And we haven't really seen that before at the level of rules and institutions. So most of the technological revolutions we've seen are in industrial technologies. They make us do things faster and better and cheaper physically. This is a revolution in institutional and governance technologies. They're very composable, and an enormous amount of talent is being directed at this problem. And I'm excited because that's where That's where growth comes from. Better institutions means better coordination, which means growth and prosperity.
We're at time, but as you have the microphone, your challenge is to ask the quickest question and someone else to give the quickest answer. So there
That
you
will
go.
be completely impossible because I mean you are super nice and lovely people, but I was meant to be the bad guy, and I think that I can take that later on a coffee.
Okay, you can be bad guy later.
But you are wrong. That was my point.
What a heroic.
I
question.
object. That's my answer. But thank you very much.
I'd like to especially thank Jack and Joni for joining us online and for their incredible deep experience and sharing that with us today, and to all my panelists and especially to you. Thanks very much.